sold to a brothel at 13, used for 6 long years. A cowboy walked her out forever and gave her childhood. The lantern was almost out when I found the girl. Not a girl she'd have told me quick enough. 19 years old, and she'd have been right, technically. But she was sitting on the floor of the upstairs hall in the painted lady with her back against the wall and her knees pulled up to her chest, and her eyes fixed on the middle distance, and what I saw wasn't a woman. What I saw was somebody who'd been trying for years not to be seen at all, who'd gotten very good at it. I wasn't supposed to be on that floor. I was a drover. Coming off a cattle run from Abilene, 10 weeks of dust and cow stink and bad coffee, and Harlan Weiss, who ran the outfit, had paid us out in the street and said, "Boys, go wash the trail off." Meaning this, the Painted Lady, which was the only establishment of consequence in Ridgeline, Texas in 1873 that offered a bath, a drink, whiskey, and the rest. I'd taken the bath. I'd taken a drink and then another. I wasn't interested in the rest, and I don't say that to make myself sound righteous. I was 41 years old, and I'd had my fill of women who didn't want to be there, which is a very particular kind of sad that stays with you longer than most. I was looking for the back stairs. A fellow at the bar had told me there was a second way down, quicker to the livery where my horse was stalled. I had a brown mare named Tuesday with a stone bruise on her near foreleg, and I wanted to check her before I slept. That's why I was on that floor. I want that understood. I wasn't going anywhere but down. She didn't look up when I came around the corner. She was so still I almost stepped over her legs before I caught myself. I stopped. She still didn't look up. I said, "Excuse me, miss." She said, "Room's paid, mister. I'll be ready in a minute." Her voice was flat, not tired the way a person is tired after a long day. Tired the way a person is tired who has been tired so long they don't remember what the other thing felt like. She started to push herself up off the floor, and I said, "No, wait," and she stopped, looked at me for the first time. Her eyes were gray and watchful the way an animal's eyes are watchful, calculating distance. I said, "I'm not here for that." She said nothing. She'd heard that before, I could tell by the way she stayed exactly where she was, not moving toward me, not moving away. I said, "I'm looking for the back stairs." She studied me a moment longer, then she pointed left. I said, "Thank you." I walked past her, got about 5 steps, stopped. I've spent a lot of years asking myself why I stopped. I've had a long time to put words to it, a long time to clean it up into something that sounds deliberate and noble, and I could do that. But the truth is I don't fully know. There was something in the flatness of her voice. Rooms paid, like she was furniture and she knew it and had decided to just be very good furniture. Something in that went into me like a cold key turning. I turned around and came back. She looked at me wary. I sat down on the floor beside her, not too close, with my back against the same wall. She shifted an inch or two away. I didn't move toward her. I said, "How old are you?" She said, "Old enough." I said, "That's not what I asked." She didn't answer for a moment. Then she said, 19. I said, "And before that?" She looked at me then, straight on. Not angry exactly. More like she was doing a calculation in her head and hadn't gotten the expected answer and wasn't sure what that meant. She said, "What do you mean by that?" I said, "I mean, how long have you been here?" She looked away again, down the hall toward the stairs, toward the sound of music and glass and men laughing below us. She said, 6 years. I was 41 years old. I'd worked cattle drives. I'd ridden for the law one bad winter in Nebraska. I'd buried 2 friends and 1 dog that I mourned longer than the friends. I'd seen most of what the frontier had to show, and I thought I was past the age of something getting under my skin and staying there. 6 years. I said it back to her without meaning to, quiet, just the words themselves. She said, quick and flat, "I don't need your pity." I said, "I don't have any to give." I said it true, not to comfort her, it was just true. What I had wasn't pity. Pity is when you look down at something from where you're standing. This was different. This was something that found a crack and settled in. I said, "Who brought you here?" Long pause. She was looking at her hands, which were folded in her lap very neatly, very deliberately, the way you fold your hands when you're keeping them from doing something else. She said, "My father. He sold me to Barclay for $32 and a horse." She said it like it was a weather report, like she'd said it enough times internally that the words had lost their shape. $32, the horse was lame. I sat there with that. After a while I said, "What's your name?" She said, "Whatever you want it to be." I said, "That's not a name." I said, "What did your mother call you?" Another long silence. The music downstairs shifted. Somebody was playing a badly tuned piano and getting away with it only because everyone below us was too drunk to notice. She said very quietly, "Cora." I said Cora, like I was confirming it, like it mattered to say it out loud in a real voice. I sat there another minute and two things happened inside me at the same time. One was the ordinary working man thing, the thing that knows how the world goes, the thing that has made peace with how much suffering gets done in out-of-the-way places where nobody powerful enough to stop it happens to be looking. The other thing was older than that, older than sense. My mother had worked a laundry in Missouri until her hands bled most mornings. I had 3 sisters who'd all found hard lives in one direction or another. And I had 41 years on this earth, and I'd done some of the things I was proud of, and I'd failed at some things I wasn't. And I was sitting on a floor in Texas next to a girl named Cora who'd been sold for $32 at 13 years old, and the question I was asking myself was, what are you going to do about it, Callum? Because there was a choice. There is always a choice. Most of the time the choice is between doing the hard thing and pretending there wasn't a choice. I said, "Cora, is there anyone in this building who looks out for you, who would stand between you and harm?" She almost laughed. It wasn't a happy sound. She said, "Barclay owns me." I said, "He owns a contract. He doesn't own you." She looked at me with those gray eyes like she was waiting for the catch. Because there's always a catch. She'd been waiting 6 years for there not to be a catch. I said, "I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to answer me straight, and then we can talk about what happens next." She waited. I said, "If you could walk out of here tonight, where would you go?" The question surprised her. I could see it in the slight shift of her whole body, the way her chin came up a fraction. Not hope, not exactly. Something more careful than hope. She was checking the question for traps. She said, "I don't have anywhere to go." I said, "That's not what I asked." She was quiet. Then she said, slow like she was saying something she'd never said out loud before because there'd been no reason to, "There's a sister. In Kansas. She doesn't know where I am. She doesn't know if I'm alive." I said, "All right." She said, "All right what?" I said, "All right, give me 20 minutes. Pack what you can carry, I'll be back." I went downstairs and found Barclay in the back room where men like Barclay always are, behind a table with money on it. He was a wide, pale man with a red face and the look of someone who ate well and slept badly. There were 2 other men in the room. I recognized one of them as a hired gun named Lester Dre, who I'd had occasion to cross paths with in Laredo 2 years prior, and who I knew to be the kind of man who did exactly what he was paid to do and nothing else. I wasn't armed with anything dramatic. I had a Colt Navy on my hip, which I'd been carrying since the war, and I had $43 cash money from the Abilene Drive, which was the entirety of my earthly wealth minus the horse and the saddle and a good knife. I put $20 on the table in front of Barclay. He looked at it, he looked at me. He said, "For one night." I said, "For the girl named Cora, permanent." There was a silence in the room that had weight to it. Barclay said, "She's not for permanent sale." I said, $20, and the story that she got sick and had to leave and nobody loses face. Or I can make a different arrangement. He said, "What kind of different arrangement?" I said, "The kind where the law in Ridgeline hears some questions about ages and records." And I looked at him steady, and I didn't look away, and I let him understand that I would do it. Not as a bluff, as a plain statement. Barclay was a smart enough businessman to understand value. What I was giving him was $20 cash and the absence of trouble, and what he was being asked to give up was a girl he'd already had 6 years out of, whose time was going to run short anyway, and who was becoming, I suspected, the kind of quiet damage walking around his halls that made the other girls uneasy. He said 40. I had $43. I said 35. He said 40 and she walks out without a scene. I put the 40 on the table, kept $3 in my pocket. He swept it up without counting it. He didn't offer me a paper, and I didn't ask for one because a piece of paper from a man like Barclay in a place like this was worth the trouble it was written on. What I had was the agreement spoken and witnessed by Lester Dre, who was a killing man but not a liar, and in that country in those years, witnessed word was often more binding than print. I went back upstairs. She was standing in the hall with a flour sack. In the sack was a change of clothes. A small wooden box I later learned held a broken comb and a tintype photograph of a woman I assumed was her mother. A Bible with the cover torn off. That was everything. She looked at me and said, "You came back." I said, "Told you I would." She said, "Men say things." I said, "I know, come on." We walked out the front door. I want you to understand what that meant. Not the back, not the side alley in the dark. The front door with the music still going and the barmen still drinking and the piano still badly tuned. I took her through the main room with my hand just at the small of her back, not gripping, just present. And I looked at every man in that room as we went by with the particular look of a man who has decided something and is comfortable explaining that decision with his fists if necessary. Nobody said anything. Barclay was in the back. His man Dre watched us go from across the room and he nodded just barely and I nodded back. We walked out into the night air. She stopped on the wooden sidewalk, just stopped, looked up. I stopped beside her, looked up too. The sky was the way it gets on the Texas plain when there's no moon. So many stars it looks like somebody spilled something. Like the sky is a wound that came open and is full of light instead of dark. She stood there looking at it. I didn't say anything. I don't know how long we stood there, it wasn't short. Then she said very quietly, "I forgot there were that many." I said, "They were always there." She said, "I know, I forgot anyway." We stood a moment more, then she said, "What happens now?" I said, "Tonight, we get a room at the hotel down the street. Separate rooms. Tomorrow morning I'll figure out how to get you to Kansas." She looked at me with those gray eyes, that calculation again. She said, "And what do you want for it?" I said, "Nothing." She said, "Nobody does nothing for nothing." I said, "I know, that's a true thing. I don't want anything from you. I want to get you to your sister." She watched me for another long moment. She said, "Why?" I thought about it. I could have said the right thing. I could have said something about justice or goodness or doing what's right in a world that mostly doesn't. But it was late and I was tired and I'd just spent my last $40 on a woman I'd known for an hour, so I said the true thing. I said, because somebody should have done it 6 years ago and they didn't, and I'm here now. Her name was Cora Birch. Her father's name was Thomas Birch. He'd been a farmer in Missouri, failed farmer, drinker. The kind of man who was always one bad season away from the bottom of something. And the bottom he found was selling his daughter to pay a gambling debt to a man named Barclay who ran a house out of Texas. She told me this over the next 2 days, not all at once. In pieces, the way a person talks when they've kept something bolted down for a long time and the bolt starts to work loose. The sister's name was Nettie. Nettie Birch, 6 years older than Cora, married to a man named Aldous Frey who had a small spread outside Dodge City. Cora didn't know if Nettie was still there. She didn't know if Nettie was alive. She'd sent 2 letters in 6 years in the early days and gotten no answers, and eventually she'd stopped. I'd sent word ahead of us to Dodge City before we left Ridgeline, through the telegraph at the general store, asking after an Aldous Frey and a woman named Nettie. Cost me 50 cents, which I borrowed from a drover named Pete Sanchez who owed me for a hand of cards, and it was the best 50 cents I ever spent. We rode north in a borrowed wagon I arranged against my saddle as collateral. Cora sat beside me on the bench with her flour sack between her feet. First day she barely talked. Watched the country go by like she was learning it again, like a man coming out of a long, dark room and having to adjust to the light. I didn't push conversation. I'm not a man who fills silence just to hear himself. We rode and I drove and she watched, and sometimes I'd point out a landmark or a bird, and she'd look, and sometimes she'd nod. That evening I made a fire, and we ate beans and biscuit, and she ate 3 portions without saying anything about it, just methodically, like someone stocking a house before a storm. I said, "Take as much as you want, there's plenty." She said, "I know, old habit." She didn't explain and I didn't ask. After the fire settled to coals, she said, "How long to Dodge?" I said, 4 days, depending on the weather. River crossings will tell us more. She said, "You don't have to come all the way." I said, "I know." She said, "I mean it. You can point me at a road and I'll find my way." I said, "I don't doubt that. I'm coming anyway." She looked at the coals for a while. Then she said, "You got a place to be, a person waiting somewhere." I said, "No." She said, what about work? You said you were on a drive. I said, drive's done. The outfit's moving on without me, which was true. Harlan Weiss had an obligation and I didn't, and when I'd told him in the morning that I wasn't riding with them to the next job, he'd looked at me with the knowing look of an old man who understood that men sometimes do the unexpected thing, and he'd shaken my hand and said, be careful. Cora was quiet for a while more. Then she said, what will you do after? I said, I don't know yet, something. She said, that's not much of a plan. I said, usually isn't. Something in that made the corner of her mouth move. Not quite a smile, the precursor to one. The land that a smile grows in, if you give it time. Second day, we hit a stretch of grassland that opened up so wide you could see the curve of the earth, and she sat up straighter on the bench, and I watched something happen in her face that I don't fully have words for. Like a fist unclenching. The land doing something to her that 6 years inside walls had taken away. She said, I used to think I'd have a horse. I said, when? She said, when I was a girl, before. I used to think I'd have a horse and some land and grow things. Tomatoes. I wanted to grow tomatoes. I said, not much grows out here besides grit and patience. She said, I know that now. I said, but Kansas has good ground, parts of it. She said, you been to Kansas. I said, I've been most places. She said, where's the best place you've been? I thought about it. I said, Montana, early spring, before the snow fully clears. The sky turns this color blue that doesn't exist anywhere else, isn't even close to the same blue as Texas. She considered this. She said, I'd like to see that. I said, probably will someday. She looked at me, said, you think so? I said, you're 19 years old, Cora. The rest of your life is a long time. It's all in front of you. She sat with that. Something in the sentence seemed to give her trouble, not in a bad way, but the way a bone gives you trouble when it's been set wrong and the doctor sets it right. There's a period of adjustment before it starts to knit. She said, quiet, nobody's ever said that to me before. I said what? She said, that something's in front of me. Third day we found the first river, and it was higher than I'd hoped, the spring runoff still feeding it. I spent an hour upstream and down looking for the shallowest crossing and found a gravel bar that looked manageable. Cora had watched me the whole time without saying anything. When I came back, she said, can we do it? I said, I think so, but I want you to get in the back of the wagon when we cross. Lie flat, hold the sides. If we tip, you go for the wagon box, not the horse, because the horse will find the bank. She said, have you tipped in a river before? I said, twice. She said, what happened? I said, got wet. She got in the back of the wagon without another word. I got us across in about 12 minutes, which felt like longer, with the water up to the axles and the mare working hard and Cora flat in the back perfectly still without making a sound. When we got to the other bank, she came forward and sat back on the bench beside me. She said, that was bad. I said, it wasn't great. She said, you ever scared? I said, during that, a little, mostly I was busy. She said, what's the difference? I said, busy is when you're doing something. Scared is when you're waiting. Keep yourself busy enough, the scared doesn't get much room. She turned that over. She said, is that true or is that just something you tell yourself? I said, maybe both. She almost smiled again, getting closer. Evening of the third day, we made camp near a creek with cottonwoods over it, and I shot a rabbit that had the poor judgment to sit still long enough, and Cora cooked it over the fire in a way that told me she knew what she was doing, seasoning it with the small tin of salt and dried herbs she'd produced from somewhere in the flour sack. I said, where'd you learn to cook? She said, my mother, before. I said, she was a good cook. She said, she was a good woman, better than anyone in her life deserved, including me. I said, you were a child. She said, I meant my father. She said it flat, the way she said most things, that flattening out she did when something had the potential to catch flame. But it caught a little bit. I could see it in the tension around her eyes. I said, none of what happened to you was your doing. She said, I know that. She said it quick, like closing a door. I said, all right. But she didn't close it all the way. After a moment she said, sometimes knowing a thing and feeling a thing are not the same. I said, no, they're not. She looked at me, said, did you know my father sold me for $32? A lame horse worth maybe $7, $8. He could have gotten 100 for me if he'd had any sense of what I was worth. She meant it as a bitter joke. She delivered it like one. But underneath the bitterness was something else, something she'd been carrying for 6 years without being able to set it down, and it had the particular weight of a thing that's been carried too long. I said, a man who sells his daughter for any amount of money doesn't know what anything is worth. She was quiet, the fire moved. Then she said, you know what I thought about in there? When things were bad, I thought about this creek we had behind our house in Missouri. Little thing, not much, you could step across it at the narrow part, but there were crayfish in it. I used to catch them, bring them home in a jar. My mother would make me put them back. She stopped. I waited. She said I kept thinking if I could just get back to that creek, just get back there. And then I'd remind myself, you can't get back, you can never get back. I said no, but there are other creeks. She looked at this creek, the dark water moving in the firelight, the cottonwoods overhead. She said, yeah, I guess there are. We pulled into the outskirts of Dodge City on the afternoon of the 4th day with the sun behind us and the town ahead throwing up its usual haze of dust and noise. Cora sat very still beside me as we came in. I could feel the tension in her without touching her. A person who's lived the way she lived doesn't come into a town easy. Too many men, too much of a certain kind of eye. I said, you don't have to look at any of them. She said, I know. I said, and if anyone says anything to you, they're saying it to the wrong woman with the wrong man. She looked at me when I said it. Something in the look, I couldn't read all of it. There was something in there that was complex and quiet and didn't translate to a simple word. The telegraph reply had come back to me in Ridgeline the morning we left. Aldous Frey runs a small farm 6 miles east of Dodge. Woman named Nettie there. The telegrapher had added at the end, tell the woman who's coming her sister's been praying a long time. When I'd read that to Cora, she'd taken the paper from my hand and looked at it for a long moment without saying anything. And then she'd folded it very carefully into squares and put it in the wooden box with the tintype and the Bible. We found the Frey farm without trouble. Low house, good fences, a vegetable garden with the first green things coming up. A woman came out of the house before we'd stopped the wagon. She must have heard us on the road, and she stood on the porch with her hand shading her eyes. I stopped the wagon about 50 yards from the house. I said to Cora, you want me to stay here? She looked at the woman on the porch. The woman had taken a step forward. Her hand was no longer shading her eyes. She was looking at the wagon and her mouth was moving a little, like she was saying something to herself. Cora said, no, come on. We got down from the wagon. Cora walked toward the porch and I came behind, not close, just behind, present. The woman came down off the porch steps and they stopped about 10 feet apart. They were the same height. They had the same gray eyes, I noticed. Same build. You could see the family in them the way you can sometimes see where a river comes from by looking at the shape of the bank. Then Nettie said, Cora. And Cora said, her voice cracking completely for the first time in 4 days, yeah. And they went together, just came together fast and hard like two people afraid the other one might vanish. Nettie was saying something, but I couldn't make it out. Cora had her face buried in her sister's shoulder and wasn't saying anything at all. I went back to the wagon and sat on the bench and found something to look at in the middle distance and left them to it. After a while, Aldous Frey came out of the barn and looked at me and looked at his wife and Cora and looked at me again. He was a square, quiet, steady-looking man in his 40s, the kind of man who'd made his peace with the world by building something solid in it. I said, she's Cora Birch, your wife's sister. She's had a hard time. She needs a place. He looked at me for a long moment. He said, and you? I said, just a driver. He said, that what you are? I said, today. He looked at the two women again, still holding each other. He said, Nettie's preyed on this girl every night for 6 years. I said, I know. He said, stay for supper. It wasn't a question. It was a decision he'd made about me on the basis of whatever it was he'd seen. And I've thought about that moment since, what it was he saw, and the only conclusion I've come to is that men who build things with their hands and their backs get good at knowing when something has been done honestly, and when it hasn't. I said, thank you. Supper was at a table that had clearly been built by hand, solid and unadorned, with 4 places set. Nettie had made something with salt pork and beans and cornbread, And Aldous had brought out a bottle of rye whiskey that was better than it had any right to be this far from civilization. Cora sat across from me. She ate again with that same focused attention, that same careful, purposeful fueling of herself. But her eyes were different now. Still watchful, still measuring, but the bass note of them had changed. Something that had been wound very tight for a very long time was not unwound, not yet. It doesn't work that fast, but loosening. Like the first day of a thaw, not warm yet, but the grip of the cold beginning to release. Nettie talked. She had the gift of it in a way Cora didn't, and I wondered if that was nature or what circumstance had done to one of them and not the other. She talked about the farm, about the hard winter they'd had, about the garden she was putting in, about a mare that had foaled in February with a coat so dark it looked painted. Cora listened, watched her sister the way you watch something you'd given up on ever seeing again. Once, Nettie looked up at me in the middle of a story and said, "I don't know how to thank you, mister." I said, "Callum, just Callum." She said, "Callum, I don't know what words there are." I said, "There aren't words, just take care of her." She said, "I've been waiting 6 years to do nothing else." After supper, Aldous and I sat outside with the whiskey. He was a man comfortable in silence, which I respected, and we sat that way for a while with the night coming on and the first stars showing. He said, "You got a place to go from here?" I said, "Not specially." He said, "I could use a hand through spring. The work's honest and the pay's nothing remarkable, but there's a roof and a bunk in the barn." I said, "I'll think on it." He said, "Think fast. I need the answer by morning." That made me laugh, which surprised us both. He smiled into his whiskey. From inside the house I could hear the two women talking, Nettie's voice, and underneath it, occasionally, Cora's, softer and slower and carefully chosen, like she was relearning the habit. I said, "She's going to need time." He said, "I know." I said, "She's seen bad things, done nothing to deserve them." He said, "Most of the worst things happen to people who didn't deserve them." He said it plainly, without bitterness, just as fact. He'd made his own peace with the shape of the world a long time ago. I said, "She's 19. She's got most of her life ahead of her." He said, "I know that too." I said, "She's strong, stronger than she knows, probably." He looked at me, said, "You know her pretty well for a man who just drove her up from Texas." I said, "You learn a person on the trail." He said, "Maybe." He paused, he said, "Or maybe some people just see each other clear." I didn't answer that. We drank our whiskey. I was in the barn when she came to find me. Late, the house dark, the stars full overhead. She came through the barn door and stood in the rectangle of night light for a moment, and I was sitting on a hay bale seeing to my saddle, which I did at the end of every day out of old habit, and I looked up and she was there. I said, "You should be sleeping." She came in and sat on the hay bale beside me, not too close, close enough that I could feel the warmth of her. She said, "I talked to Nettie for 4 hours." I said, "That's good." She said she cried twice. I only cried once. I said, "Progress." She said, "She wants me to stay." She said it like a question she was still working out the answer to. I said, "What do you want?" She thought about it, said, "I want to stay. I want to help her with the garden. I want to learn the farm. I want." She stopped. I said, "What?" She said, "I want to figure out who I am. If there's a person under all that." She said it plainly, not dramatically, the way you state something you've been thinking for a long time and have finally found the words for. I said, "There's a person under all that." She said, "How do you know?" I said, "Because I've been sitting with her for 4 days." She was quiet. The barn smelled of horse and hay and old wood. Tuesday shifted in her stall, settled back. Then Cora said, "You're going to stay on the farm." I said, "Aldous asked me to, through spring at least." She said, "And after?" I said, "After, I don't know." She was quiet for a moment more, then she said, "Callum." I said, "Yeah." She said, "I want to tell you something, and I don't want you to say anything back about it until I'm done." I said, "All right." She said, "I have spent 6 years learning that no one does anything for nothing. Every kindness has a backside. Every man who was gentle because it cost him less that way. I know that's not true of everyone. I knew it even in there. I knew some people were different, but I stopped being able to tell which was which a long time ago." She paused. She said, "You spent your last dollar getting me out. You spent 4 days on a road you had no business being on. You handed me to my sister. And then you went to the barn like the whole thing was done. I said, the whole thing is done. She said, I'm not finished. I said, sorry. She said, I've been sitting with Nettie trying to talk about what I want. And the thing I keep not saying out loud is, she stopped. I waited. I was looking at my saddle and I didn't turn to look at her because I could tell she needed to say it to the barn and not to my face. She said, I don't know if I'm capable of the ordinary things, the things women have, the things I was supposed to have before. I don't know if that's available to me. I don't know if I can be. She stopped again, took a breath. She said, I don't know if any of this works. For me, the normal way. I need you to know that going in, whatever going in means. I put the saddle down. I turned and looked at her. Her chin was up a little, the way it did when she was being brave. That particular bravery she had that was neither loud nor theatrical. Just a quiet determination to not let a thing break her that hadn't managed to break her yet. I said, Cora. She said, what? I said, there isn't a wrong way to be a person. There's just being a person. Everything else is something people made up to keep each other in line. She looked at me for a long time, her gray eyes in the dark, the barn settling around us, the horse quiet, the stars outside. She said, you're a strange man, Callum. I said, probably. She said, you came up those stairs looking for the back way out. I said, I did. She said, and you sat down on the floor. I said, I did. She said, why? I'd answered this before that night in Ridgeline, and the true answer hadn't changed. I said, because somebody should have done it a long time ago. She nodded slowly, like she was taking it in again, sitting it down somewhere different than before. Then she reached over and took my hand. Not the way a woman takes a man's hand in a story, not like that. She took it the way a person takes something they're not sure they're allowed to have, careful, making sure it would hold. Her hand was smaller than mine and still had the cold of the night air in it. I turned my hand over and held it, that was all. We sat in the barn a long time. Spring is a different country in Kansas than in Texas. The light comes differently, softer, more willing. The ground opens up and you can smell what's under it, all that dark, patient earth that's been locked under frost for months, and when the warmth hits it, it gives something up. Nettie's garden went in the first week of April. Cora was out there every morning before I came back from the north pasture, on her knees in the dirt, which was an image that did something to me I'd have had trouble naming, the earnestness of it, the concentration she gave it, the way she talked to the seedlings under her breath like they were animals that needed the encouragement. Tomatoes, she'd gotten Nettie to order the seeds from a catalog in February, before I'd arrived, as if she'd known, which of course she hadn't. But there they were. She showed me the first one, a tiny green thing on a vine barely 8 inches tall, one morning when I was coming back from turning out the stock. She was crouching at the end of the row, and she looked up at me and held the little fruit between 2 fingers, careful as anything. She said, look at that. I said, there it is. She said, is that not the most? She stopped, laughed a little, actual laugh. It startled both of us. She shook her head and looked back at the tomato. She said, I grew something. I said, you did. She said, quiet, never grew anything before. I looked down at her, there in the dirt, the April light on her face, and she looked up at me, and she had a smear of earth across her left cheekbone she was unaware of, and her gray eyes were clear in a way they hadn't been on that hall floor in the Painted Lady 6 months before. Not healed. Not done, but pointed somewhere, looking forward, which is a different thing and takes longer to build, and once you have it, you protect it with everything. She stood up, brushed her hands on her trousers. She looked at me a moment more, and then she reached up and set her palm flat against my chest. Over the heart, the way you might touch something you're checking is still there. She said, thank you, not for Kansas, not for the $40, just thank you. I put my hand over hers and held it there. I said, you did the hard part, I just drove the wagon. She said, Callum. I said, yeah. She said, you know that's not true. I said, I know. We stood there in the garden with the tomato vine at her feet, and the morning light coming over the fence, and Tuesday in the near pasture tearing up the good spring grass. And I was 41 years old and flat broke, and a long way from anything I'd started out toward, and I had never in my life felt less lost. I stayed through spring and into summer, through the first harvest, through a night in July when a bad storm came up fast from the southwest, and I spent 3 hours in the barn with Cora keeping the animals calm, the two of us in the dark and the noise, her voice steady, talking to the horses in a low murmur that was the most useful kind of brave. I stayed through autumn, through the first frost. Aldous never said much about it, being Aldous. Nettie said plenty, mostly to herself, and occasionally to me when she was sure Cora wasn't in earshot, and most of what she said amounted to, "You're a good man, and my sister has never trusted anyone easily, and I am watching, Callum." I said, "Good, watch all you want." She said, "You mean that?" I said, "I mean it." She studied me the way women study a man when they're deciding something permanent. Then she said, "All right, then." There wasn't a ceremony. We weren't those kinds of people. One day in the late fall, Cora came and stood beside me on the porch after supper and said, "I'd like you to stay, not for the season. Stay." I said, "That what you want?" She said, "I've been thinking about it since April." I said, "Since the tomato." She said, "Since before the tomato, if I'm honest." She paused. She said, "Since you sat down on the floor next to me." I said, "That was the first night." She said, "I know when it was." I looked out at the land. The last light in the western sky over the flats, that particular orange that lasts about 4 minutes and then is gone. The frost in the air. The smell of Nettie's wood smoke coming from the chimney behind us. I said, "I'll stay." She turned and looked at me, full on, the way she looked at things she was making sure were real. Then she put both arms around me and held on, and I put my arms around her and held on back, and we stood that way on the porch while the last of the light went. She was small enough that the top of her head came to my jaw. I could feel her breathing, slow and even. Feel her heartbeat against my chest. She smelled like wood smoke and earth and the particular clean smell of a person who has worked a good day and knows it. She said into my shoulder, "I grew 7 pounds of tomatoes." I said, "I know, I ate most of them." She said, "You did." I said, "Next year you'll plant more." She said, "Next year I'll plant a whole field." I said, "You'll do it too." She said, "Yeah, I will." The light was gone. The stars were coming up, the same stars that had been over the painted lady in Ridgeline, the same ones that had been over the Texas plain and the creek with the cottonwoods, over every road we traveled, patient and constant and full of a light so old it makes the short duration of a human life feel small. And also, somehow, precious, in the way that small things are precious because they are brief and finite and won't last. Her arms around me, the frost sharpening the air, the farm quiet around us. I was 41 years old and I had nothing, and I had everything. I stood there and I did not move.